Okay, welcome everyone to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're diving into, well, a really captivating animal, the Sika deer.
Mm.
And what's great is this whole exploration is based entirely on the sources you sent us. So a big thank you for those.
Yeah, it's a fascinating stack of material. Really gives you a pretty full picture of this species.
It really does. So our mission today is to unpack all that, to try and understand the world of the Sika deer Cervus nippon.
Right.
Not just, their biology, but their complex roles in ecosystems, their history with humans, and the really significant challenges they're facing now.
And the sources you provided, they paint a picture that's, well, it's got some surprising twists.
Definitely. Full of interesting details and, like you said, maybe some contradictions too.
Yeah, what really jumps out is how their story, it changes dramatically depending on where in the world you're looking at them.
That seems to be the core of it, doesn't it?
Yep.
So let's jump in. Let's start with the basics. What did these sources tell us about Sika deer themselves? What are they like?
Well, they're often called the spotted deer. And, for good reason.
Right.
Their coats are typically this rich brown color, and they have these very distinctive white spots. You see them mostly in the summer. Really striking.
You definitely know it's a Sika when you see those spots. And they're not huge deer, are they?
No, they're relatively small, actually, compared to, say, red deer or elk.
Okay.
The males, the stags, they're usually around 60 to 100 kilos. Females are lighter, maybe 40 to 60 kilograms.
They're quite compact.
Yeah. And that size, combined with their natural agility, seems really key to how they survive in all sorts of terrain.
And where are they originally from, their native range?
Primarily East Asia.
Yeah.
So places like Japan, China, Taiwan, and parts of Southeast Asia, too.
Okay.
But what's truly remarkable, and it's a theme throughout these sources, is just how adaptable they are. They can thrive in incredibly different places.
Yeah.
Dense forest, open grasslands, even right on the edge of cities sometimes. Different climates, different landscapes. They seem to manage.
You can see why that adaptability, plus their looks, would make them appealing, historically and maybe even now.
Exactly. They're quite beautiful animals. But that very adaptability, as you hinted, leads us straight into the next big point from the sources.
Yeah.
Which is where things get, well, complicated.
Right. Their role in ecosystems, it sounds like it's not straightforward.
Not at all. It's really a tale of two very different impacts, depending on the context.
Okay, let's break that down then. So in their native habitats, the sources suggest they play a sort of beneficial role.
They do, generally. As herbivores, they're important for shaping the vegetation. They're grazing, they're browsing. It influences which plants grow and how well.
Okay.
Plus, they help disperse seeds through their droppings. That helps plants spread.
And the material mentions something about them creating open patches in forests.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
By feeding, they can clear out bits of the understory. That lets more sunlight reach the ground, which can actually boost habitat diversity. So when populations are in balance in their native range, they're a positive part of the ecosystem.
But then you look at what happens when they get introduced somewhere else. Outside that native range, that's where the picture flips, isn't it?
It really does. The sources are quite clear on this. In places like the UK, New Zealand, parts of North America, they were brought in deliberately.
Why was that?
Often in the 19th and 20th centuries, mainly as game animals for hunting.
Ah, okay. Makes sense.
But here's the problem. In these new places, they often don't have their natural predators.
The ones that kept their numbers in check back home.
Right. Things like wolves or lynx.
Yeah.
Without those controls, their populations can just, boom, explode.
And too many deer means
Severe overgrazing.
damaging the local plants.
Devastating native vegetation, yeah. Which then threatens the local biodiversity. The sources gave a really stark example from the U.S. Maryland's eastern shore.
What happened there?
Apparently, the introduced Sika have become so numerous, they're actually outcompeting the native white-tailed deer for food. Yeah, and that significantly changes the whole local ecosystem. Overgrazing doesn't just hit the plants either. It can lead to soil erosion, and it reduces food for other animals too. It's a ripple effect.
And I think the sources mentioned a risk of them breeding with native deer.
Yes, hybridization. That's another serious concern.
Yeah.
Where their ranges overlap with closely related native species. It can dilute the unique genetics of those native populations.
So this whole situation in introduced areas really highlights the need for careful management, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The sources stress things like much stricter controls on any new introductions and active population management where they're already established, like control hunting or maybe relocation.
Understanding that split personality, helpful here, harmful there, seems crucial.
It's absolutely fundamental to how we interact with this species globally, yeah.
Okay, so moving from their ecological impact, let's focus back on the deer themselves. What about their specific traits, their behavior? What makes a Sika deer tick, according to the sources?
Well, we mentioned the size and those spots, which, by the way, tend to fade a bit in winter when their coats get darker and thicker.
Right.
And the males, the stags, have antlers, typically 3 or 4 points or tines. They shed them and regrow them every year.
Classic deer behavior. And when are they most active? Are they out all day?
Generally, no. They're described as crepuscular,
Which means?
most active around dawn and dusk, those twilight hours.
Any idea why?
Well, in their native range, it's likely an adaptation to avoid predators, the ones that might be more active during full daylight or deep night.
Smart. A good survival tactic.
They
What about finding food? How does their diet change with the seasons?
highly adaptable here, too.
Yeah.
It really reflects their ability to live in different environments. Spring and summer, it's lots of tender grasses, leaves.
The good stuff.
Yeah. Then in autumn, they go for fruits, berries, nuts if they can find them. But when winter hits, or in harsher conditions, they have to switch to eating things like bark and twigs.
And that's where that overpopulation issue can bite again, right? Too many deer eating bark.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If populations are too high, that winter browsing on bark and twigs can seriously damage forests and stop young trees from regenerating.
The sources also mentioned they have a really distinct sound.
They do. The males, especially. They have this high-pitched whistle or scream. Sometimes it's just called the Sika call.
And they use that.
During the rutting season, which is in the fall, it's their breeding season, they use the call either to attract females or to warn off rival males. It's quite something to hear, apparently.
So the rut is in the fall. What's the timing after that for offspring?
Gestation, the pregnancy, lasts about 220 days. Females usually just have one fawn, maybe twins if food is really abundant, but one is typical.
Okay.
And the fawns, of course, are born with those spots, perfect camouflage. They stay hidden in vegetation for the first few weeks, with the mother visiting to nurse them.
Which, again, looping back, great strategy for fawn survival. But you can see how without predators, that could lead to numbers increasing very fast.
It definitely contributes to their potential for rapid population growth, yes.
Okay, let's shift gear a bit and talk about the challenges Sika deer themselves are facing, especially from a conservation perspective. What are the big threats the sources highlighted?
Across their native range, the number one threat seems to be habitat loss. Just the sheer pressure from urbanization, agriculture expanding, deforestation.
Taking away their space.
Exactly. Less space for foraging, for breeding, for finding shelter.
And that often leads to habitats getting broken up, doesn't it? Fragmentation.
It does.
Hmm.
And that's a huge problem. It forces deer into smaller, more isolated patches of suitable habitat.
Which concentrates their impact.
Right. You get intensified pressure on the plants within those patches, localized overgrazing, more competition for resources. And the sources mention something interesting. This fragmentation can even make the deer more sedentary. They just stay put in these smaller areas, which can make the environmental damage in those specific spots even worse.
Japan was mentioned as an example of that.
Yeah, where habitat fragmentation has led to some real localized overpopulation headaches, even while the species overall might be doing okay in the country.
And that touches on another point. Their conservation status isn't simple, is it? It varies quite a lot.
That's a really key nuance the sources brought out. You can't just talk about Sika deer conservation status as one thing. It's made up of several distinct subspecies,
Okay.
and their statuses vary wildly. Some native subspecies, like the main Japanese Sika deer, are actually listed as least concern by the IUCN.
That's the international body that assesses risk.
Yeah. So their populations are relatively stable, especially where they're protected. But then you look at others, like the South China Sika deer, and they're listed as endangered,
Why the difference?
primarily due to really severe habitat loss and historical poaching pressures in their specific regions.
So you've got this really complex situation. Some populations fine, some endangered, and then in other parts of the world, the same species is seen as an invasive pest.
Exactly. It makes conservation incredibly challenging. You need a really nuanced approach.
How so?
Well, you have to balance trying to save endangered native populations while also managing the ecological problems caused by invasive populations elsewhere. The sources pointed to things like habitat restoration for native deer, careful population monitoring everywhere, and, crucially, public education.
Were there any bright spots mentioned? Successful conservation efforts?
Yes, thankfully,
Yeah.
which is encouraging. Nara Park in Japan often comes up. The deer populations there are thriving, partly thanks to specific management programs and the whole ecotourism aspect.
Right.
Taiwan was mentioned too, where reforestation efforts have helped Sika numbers recover. And in China, serious habitat restoration work combined with anti-poaching enforcement has apparently led to a recovery for some of those threatened subspecies.
That's good to hear. It shows that targeted action can work.
Definitely.
Now let's dig into another fascinating angle from the sources, their cultural significance, particularly in Japan, which seemed quite prominent.
Oh, absolutely. The cultural connection there is incredibly deep, especially in places like Nara and on Miyajima Island.
They're not just seen as animals.
No. Historically and culturally, they're often viewed as sacred. Messengers of the gods in Shinto tradition. They symbolize things like longevity, good fortune.
Wow. And that plays out in places like Nara Park.
Famously so. That's where you have thousands of deer roaming completely freely, interacting directly with tourists.
People feeding them those special rice crackers.
Exactly, the Shika Senbei. It's become this iconic, unique cultural experience.
But the sources hinted that this close interaction has downsides too.
It does. While it's culturally important, there are concerns. The deer can become overly reliant on people feeding them.
Changing their natural behavior.
Yes, altering their natural foraging habits.
Yeah.
It can potentially lead to health issues for the deer, or even make them aggressive towards people if food isn't available or they expect it.
I see.
It really highlights the need for responsible tourism, even in a place with such a long history of interaction. Managing that relationship is key.
And then, contrasting that, you have their value purely as game animals elsewhere, which led to those introductions we talked about, the ones causing ecological issues.
Right. It just reinforces that wider point about public education being so important. People need to understand the potential consequences of their actions, whether it's introducing a species somewhere new or just feeding a wild animal in a park.
Okay, so let's circle back to something you mentioned right at the start, their incredible adaptability. The sources seem to keep returning to this as central to their whole story.
It really is key. Their ability to adapt is why they've become so widespread, sometimes successfully integrating, sometimes causing problems. They've shown they can make a living in landscapes heavily altered by humans.
From deep forests right into suburban areas?
Exactly, exploiting the edges, finding food where they can.
There was a specific study mentioned, wasn't there, about urban deer adapting?
Yes, a 2023 study looked at Sika deer living in urban environments in Japan.
And what did it find?
It found they were actually becoming more nocturnal, shifting their main activity times to the night,
To avoid people.
likely to avoid peak human activity. Yeah, and maybe also urban predators, like free-roaming dogs. It's a fascinating example of behavioral adaptation in action.
But the sources also pointed out that this very adaptability makes managing them trickier.
It does. Because if their behavior is constantly shifting in response to us, it complicates things like accurately monitoring their population numbers or figuring out the best management strategies. They're a moving target in a way.
So research isn't just, interesting background. It's vital for actually doing conservation or management effectively.
Absolutely critical. Genetic studies, for example, help track population health and understand risks like hybridization. And behavioral studies, like that urban deer one, directly feed into developing adaptive management plans, strategies that can change as the deer and their environment change.
Which leads us nicely to thinking about the future. What did the sources suggest are the main strategies moving forward for Sika Deer?
They kind of synthesize the key approaches. Habitat restoration is fundamental, especially for native populations, things like reforestation, creating and protecting reserves.
Giving them space.
Right. Then there's population management, which is obviously more relevant in those non-native invasive situations. That could involve controlled hunting, maybe even the sterilization programs in some specific context.
And public education, which we keep coming back to.
Essential.
Yeah.
Raising awareness about responsible interactions, the impacts of habitat loss, the reasons for management actions. That's crucial for getting public support and cooperation.
And underlying all of that.
Continued research and monitoring. We need to keep learning about their behavior, their genetics, their ecological interactions to make informed decisions.
So it really sounds like the future for Sika Deer hinges on finding this delicate balance, balancing their needs and ecological roles with our own human activities and footprint.
Exactly. Prioritizing habitat preservation where they belong and implementing responsible research-based management everywhere else seems to be the only sustainable path forward.
Yeah.
It's complex because their situation varies so much place to place.
Well, this deep dive into the material you shared has certainly painted a vivid picture. Sika deer are clearly these extraordinary, incredibly adaptable creatures.
Mm.
They hold significant ecological weight, deep cultural meaning in some places, but they also face this really complex tangle of challenges, mostly driven by us, by human impact and movement.
And it underscores the need for proactive conservation, thoughtful management, and just a much more responsible approach to how we interact with wildlife globally.
Absolutely. So, as we wrap up, let's leave you, our listeners, with a final thought to chew on, drawing directly from this theme of their incredible adaptability. Given their remarkable ability to adjust, even thriving in landscapes we build and interacting directly with us, how does our approach to conservation need to adapt right alongside them? How do we ensure their long term survival and minimize those conflicts when they're so capable of making a home, sometimes quite literally, within our own world?